So just a very quick introduction before Davy does his part. I've kind of taken us through the kind of main content of today. But just a quick overview of the Fairer Scotland Duty. We've got Davy's example of practice. Go through some of the definitions that are included in the guidance and sort of for consideration within the Fairer Scotland Duty and thinking about socio-economic disadvantage. I'll kind of mention some of the links to other legislation and what exacerbates socio-economic disadvantage. But have a think about what needs to be in place to effectively implement it. We think about cumulative impact, and then some of the examples of practice, and that will be clear as well from Mr. Renfrewshire, and then a wee bit of time for questions, hopefully. So the Fairer Scotland Duty places a legal responsibility to play due regard to how you can reduce inequality of outcome, excuse me, and the inequality causes that result of living in socio-economic disadvantage. So this diagram is from the guidance, and it outlines what the government have identified as the key drivers of socio-economic disadvantage and some of those inequalities that result. So we have socio-economic background, low or no wealth, low income, area deprivation, material deprivation, and we'll go into some of the definitions of them in a little bit. And then some of the inequalities of outcome that can result from that because of living in socio-economic disadvantage are things like, poor attainment in school, poor skills, and then then that leading to lower paid work or less secure work, maybe not having the same opportunities to advance as you might do within the employment field, and greater chance of being a victim of crime, especially if you live in an area of deprivation where you get higher chances of crime. There's less chance of being treated with dignity and respect. There's a lot of stigma around poverty and inequality, although I think that conversation's changing, and lower healthy life expectancy and lower and poor health, and we'll go into a wee bit more detail on some of the outcomes later as well. So back to this slide again with the diagram, just as a reminder that the Fairer Scotland Duty has components of deprivation and socio-economic disadvantage causing inequality of outcomes. And I mentioned just there that the Fairer Scotland Duty came into force in April 2018, and it's about active consideration. So Davy's example is a really good one, where they've been actively considering how you can reduce inequalities of outcome if you're making that big decision, so a strategic decision to move premises, and you've got an estates management board to sort of actively think about, well, what can we do to better the situation for people living in socio-economic disadvantage. And like with the public sector equality duty, in order to evidence that you've paid that consideration in that due regard, you should publish a written assessment showing how you've done this. I've got some slides in another presentation if you want, that kind of take you through that process of how to go through the sort of, and where you should publish and so on. So but it's very basic. It's up to you, basically, in your own area to decide how you would publish that on your website, either in one distinct area or through existing plans that are maybe going up with an impact assessment attached to it. The important thing to think about the Fairer Scotland Duty, it doesn't override other considerations. So mentioned the public sector equality duty, but you've also got a duty of best value in a lot of public bodies. So it always has to be built into that, and there's a sort of balance to be had for it all. And the Equality and Human Rights Commission are the regulator for the duty, and they brought out a report earlier this year looking at how well Scotland had been doing in implementing the Fairer Scotland Duty, and had also looked at how Wales were preparing for it, because they implemented the duty in March this year, copying Scotland essentially. And I know that some areas in England are actually looking to implement, whilst it's not in legislation, a lot of them are acting as if it's in place as well and as a statutory duty. So in terms of thinking about, well, what is socioeconomic disadvantage? I mentioned the definitions that we would cover. So in broad terms, socioeconomic disadvantage means living on a low income compared to others in Scotland with little or no accumulated wealth, leading to greater material deprivation, restricting the ability to access basic goods and services. So communities of place and of interest can experience it. But what you need to remember in terms of that communities of place is that disadvantage isn't always geographically concentrated, especially in rural areas. And we know from the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation that sometimes we can focus a bit too much on the concentrations of deprivation and forget about the rural areas and other areas, maybe more affluent areas, where poverty can be in smaller pockets about the place. But also, SIMD is a very useful tool to get some data in terms of areas, but also remembering that balance of the different components of poverty and where people live. So low income is a key driver of a range of negative outcomes and can be defined in a range of ways. So a lot of sort of measures that we use would be things like relative poverty after housing costs, which is quite useful, looking at the number of individuals living in households in Scotland with incomes below 60% of the UK median income. So that gives you an idea of, if you're looking for statistics, where, what level of low income there is in a local area. There's statistics on absolute poverty, which looks at whether households' living standards are changing over time, and also persistent poverty, where households live in poverty for 3 years out of 4. And you can get them via the Scottish Government website. Low wealth, having access to wealth, is about things like having access to financial products, equity from housing, a decent pension, because that provides some protection from socioeconomic disadvantage, particularly when the wealth comes in the form of accessible savings. And we are very aware that due to COVID, people who perhaps are on lower incomes had a bit of savings, have had to tap into those savings and have perhaps gone into debt to enable them to get through the pandemic, either through having been furloughed or losing that 20%. If you're on a lower income, losing 20% of your income has a much bigger impact than if you're on a higher wage. And also then having extra costs at home, particularly over winter, heating your home all day, and having extra costs for feeding your children as well if you're living in a very, very low income. So wealth is even more unequally distributed in income, and I think that's become worse over the pandemic. Material deprivation refers to households being able to access basic goods and services, and in data terms tends to focus on families with children and on pensioner households. But obviously, if households cannot afford to buy items like home contents insurance, a warm winter coat for their children, or don't have money to repair or replace broken electrical goods, then that can impact on outcomes. And area deprivation I've already mentioned in terms of living in a deprived area, and that can exacerbate negative outcomes for individuals and households already affected by issues of low income. A lot of the most deprived areas face significant challenges, and it's particularly the case for deep-rooted deprivation. So some areas in Scotland since 2004, when the first SIMD stats came out, have consistently been among the 5% most deprived in Scotland. So, there's this kind of pernicious poverty there that's very, very difficult to challenge. And it's so deep-rooted that it needs, really big, massive step change to make that difference to people's lives. And socioeconomic backgrounds, the last one that's sort of set out in the guidance in terms of what in the definition of socioeconomic disadvantage, and that's the structural disadvantage that can arise from a parent's education, employment and income. So essentially social class, and it's a final key factor in this sort of definition. And while Scotland doesn't measure social mobility the same way that England and Wales do, there is a social mobility report from the Commission that can set out some of the sort of changes within Scotland as well around that. So it's, whether or not you have networks through your parents, perhaps from working or from university and things like that, can have that impact on your future in terms of how you move on in work and how it sets aspiration for you from your family as well, perhaps. So it's this complex interaction of the wide range of factors from poverty to health, education, limited social mobility, housing, and lack of expectations that can cause the issues for people. And Scotland's seen a significant increase in income and wealth inequality and child poverty in recent years. And again, COVID has only shone a spotlight on that even more. But there's also clear links to equality and diversity considerations and the protected characteristics. They can't be separated. So there is that intersectionality between socioeconomic disadvantage and protected characteristics and discrimination and lack of opportunity. So, for example, today in Scotland, disabled people are twice as likely to be unemployed as non-disabled people. Ethnic minorities in Scotland are twice as likely to be living in poverty and twice as likely to be unemployed and 4 times as likely to be living in overcrowded housing. And in even leading industry sectors, women are often concentrated in junior and middle management posts or in low paying roles, particularly if they're lone parents, in terms of having to have part-time work to accommodate caring responsibilities. And on average, women earn £182.90 per week less than men in Scotland. That's figures from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they're probably more up-to-date ones recently. But there's still sort of these considerations to think about sex and race and disability in terms of people's access to employment and income and money in their pockets. So defining inequality of outcome, we've talked about all the different components earlier, but any measurable differences between those who've experienced socioeconomic disadvantage and the rest of the population. So for example, in health, life expectancy or educational attainment. And some of you might be familiar with the Glasgow Underground map or the train map that I think the Glasgow Centre for Population Health did, which showed, between a few stops on the train, that life expectancy drops massively in the more impoverished areas. So it's really important to think about those inequalities of outcome that people are experiencing and how they can, be improved, and certainly use some examples of the impact of inequalities experienced. And for things like exclusion rates from school, lower educational attainment, and not being able to move on to employability at a higher level. I mentioned stigma earlier on and lack of respect. There's definitely poorer health and poorer mental health, both of which can lead to lower life expectancy and poor healthy life expectancy as well. So it's not even just about how long you live; it's about how active and able you are within that period of time. The older we get, the more likely we are to become disabled, as joints wear out and so on, and hearing goes or eyesight goes. But how can we support people to have better life expectancy and better healthy life expectancy within that? If you're living in deprivation, you're more likely to be overweight or obese, and that's particularly for women and children, actually. Higher risk of homelessness if you don't have that backup of wealth or any form of savings. Anything that could mean that you lose your home would mean that you wouldn't be able to get something else necessarily. There'll also be other issues tied in with that as well. It's not just as simple as just not having running out of money, but there's other components to it. But there's a higher risk of homelessness, and you're more likely to be in low-paid work because of that lower educational attainment and the higher exclusion rates. And I mentioned we're more likely to be a victim of crime. Again, COVID highlighted some of the issues in terms of inequality of outcome, where people didn't have digital access to be able to engage, for their children to engage with online schooling. There's a lack of childcare meant that people had to give up their jobs or cut their hours. Real poverty was a massive issue, and so that will result in things like poorer educational outcomes and potentially food poverty as well for people, and exacerbating already poor situations for people. The duties set at a strategic level, and for some organisations it's quite challenging to think the way through. The intention is that it is something that sits at that high level. So things like strategy documents, decisions about setting priorities, allocating resources, commissioning services, all these kind of decisions that would be agreed at a board level or equivalent or a committee. And the idea is that strategic decisions are the ones that have a major impact on the way in which other tactical and day-to-day operational decisions are taken, but they're not in themselves tactical or operational. It's not about the frontline delivery, it's about the overarching direction of travel and how things are going to be delivered from a corporate and strategic perspective. So consideration of how to reduce socioeconomic inequalities can obviously improve any decision making, not just at the strategic level, but the statutory focus of the duty is at that higher level. But the ultimate aim, essentially, for the consideration of socioeconomic disadvantage to be mainstreamed, and it has been happening across public bodies in Scotland for years. It is something that factors in, given that there's areas of high levels of deprivation, there's people living in socioeconomic disadvantage, that we need to think about how we target our services towards. Some of the examples that we've got here in terms of sort of the strategic level is things like local development plans and councils. There's the city deals, which are regional economic partnerships delivering particular projects in local areas. things like preparing legislation, any new strategic frameworks, but also for organisations that maybe aren't delivering lots of practical, tactical, operational stuff on the ground. You might only agree a high-level corporate document every 3 to 4 years. So you're not going to be doing the Fairer Scotland duty assessments all the time. So you wouldn't, be, but some other organisations will be making these different strategies all the time, and having to get them agreed at higher level, at board level, or committee level. For some organisations, it may be that because you're not delivering on the front line, essentially, or you're directed by legislation to do a very particular thing, that you might want to then think internally about how Fairer Scotland duty would affect, for example, your workforce from a strategic perspective. So if you were thinking about workforce planning, then you could maybe think about how that would look. Or if you're looking at things like future operating models, voluntary redundancy strategies, any sort of whole organisation things that you might be thinking of, then you would apply the Fairer Scotland duty to that, rather than necessarily something that's out on the ground in terms of delivery, depending on how you're set up. And then quickly defining due regard. This is about the active consideration that I mentioned earlier on. So it's about coming to with an open mind, thinking about the opportunities to reduce inequalities of outcome caused by socioeconomic disadvantage. But it's also to make sure that the things that you're putting in place aren't going to exacerbate socioeconomic disadvantage and inequality of outcome as well. So there's that very active consideration, and that's due regard should be familiar to you from the public sector equality duty, and how we sort of carry that out as well. So for the Fairer Scotland duty bodies, you need to identify if inequalities of outcome will be exacerbated by your strategic decision in question, or whether there are opportunities to reduce that inequality of outcome, in a nutshell. As with the public sector equality duty, you need to consider the duty as early as possible for any major plans and decisions. So when you can still make a change to that process. There's no point in doing it retrospectively at the end when actually it's just about to go to committee and you can't change anything. So you need to get in there early. Obviously not too early, because then you need to have something to make a decision on and think about how it's going to impact. But you need to make sure that it's built in as part of any process for deciding on strategic decisions, whether it be a corporate plan or a budget, or when making decisions at committee. And you need to have that record of assessment of the assessment process to publish, the same as you would with inequality impact assessments. The guidance suggests that bodies who want to engage with those who the decision will directly affect, this would make sense. So getting that lived experience to understand the impact that your decision might have on people at a local level. But you need to keep in mind proportionality. So if it is something that's really high level and strategic, there's not enough for local people to get their teeth into, really, because you're not thinking about a service that's getting delivered to them. Sometimes it can be difficult to get them. It's a bit more esoteric at that higher level. But certainly it's good to use any engagement and consultation information that you have as part of your evidence while you're carrying out the assessment. And this is where it can cross over with the equality impact assessment as well. You might have been engaging with particular groups, and that should inform your thinking about your Fairer Scotland duty assessment as well. There's also, because it's to pay due regard, there's not an obligation to achieve a result. But if you did identify negative impact, it would be remiss for you not to mitigate that impact, and it's very unlikely that would happen anyway. But it's just to think about that proportionality of the whole thing, but also just making sure that you're paying that due regard, and you can evidence that you've paid due regard to it. And so there's a series of stages set out in the guidance, and this is the diagram from it, and it hasn't changed significantly at all in the refreshed guidance. So the kind of key stages, planning, is your actual proposal or decision strategically important or not? And so that's for the organisation to decide whether or not it is at that strategic level. If it is, then you begin a Fairer Scotland duty assessment, or build it into perhaps an integrated impact assessment if that's the way you're going. And if it's not, then you need to identify that and publish it. So within the new guidance, there's a sample assessment not required template if you want to use something like that. or you can just create your own. But as long as you're clearly setting out that you assessed it and you identified that it's not a strategic decision or proposal. Stage 2 is the most important. Stage 2 and 3 are the most important for me in terms of you need to have evidence to be able to inform your assessment. So you need to understand what's happening in terms of socio-economic disadvantage of those that your strategic decision or proposal are going to impact on. To understand, what would happen, if you change your proposal or if you made it more proactive about reducing socio-economic disadvantage and inequality, and just use that to inform the discussion. Another key point to say about the assessment is it's not for one person to do on their own. It should be a team effort. It should be those who have developed the decision or proposal or strategy, plus perhaps someone who's within your organisation who's maybe sort of been helping support the impact assessment process, who can give you some insight into what are the kind of things that you should be thinking of, but certainly not something you should be doing on your own. It should be a small team together, considering the evidence and carrying out stage 3, which is the assessment and improvement. So looking to see, what are the issues? Is anybody going to be negatively impacted? Can you actively reduce inequalities of outcome through your policy or decision? And then your decision-making process, it needs to be signed off by an appropriate officer at a significantly senior level to do that for the organisation, and then your publication after that. The Scottish Government are quite keen for public bodies subject to the duty to be quite innovative in their implementation of the duty. So the guidance isn't very prescriptive in terms of how you do it, other than setting out the key requirement of paying due regard, and that's the statutory duty that you have to fulfil. So it's you don't have to follow this specific process, as long as you've got your own process that covers all the different areas that you need, and you can show that you've looked at evidence and that you've carried out an assessment and looked to any sort of improvement actions that you think are appropriate. So what I'm going to do there is take a quick 5-minute break. Let everybody get up, move around. Okay, so I thought it'd be worthwhile just quickly kind of covering some of the things that need to be in place to deliver the Fairer Scotland duty. So this has been from engagement with officers delivering and thinking about what other things need to be in place in order to have success in implementation of anything. So one of the key ones that's come up again and again is leadership from the top. So there needs to be buy-in from the top across organisations with a knowledge in senior management teams of the requirements and practicalities of the Fairer Scotland duty. Senior management need to take a leadership role and champion the reduction of socio-economic disadvantage and the resultant inequality. And they need to make sure that consideration is given to the duty when making those key decisions. And tied into that, obviously, is awareness of the Fairer Scotland duty across the organisation, which then also ties into training for everyone. So, the intention of these sessions has been to raise awareness. We're going to make a video out of sort of the 4 sessions. We'll pick out the best bits where the technology has worked and everything's gone smoothly. And we'll use that and we'll share that as a training resource so anyone can use that internally to promote understanding of the duty across their organisations. So even you have to do sort of create something yourself, but there's also on the K-Hub some sort of generic slides about the Fairer Scotland duty that people can use if you want to carry out training and awareness raising within your organisation. And that's really important, just to make sure that people feel that they understand what the duty is, but also to take some of the fear away from it, because sometimes it feels a bit overwhelming to do all these different types of impact assessment. But once people understand it and understand the things they should be thinking about, then it can become embedded and it can become second nature. So you don't have to go through a big rigorous process, that it's actually something that happens naturally as you go on. You're still going to have to evidence that you've carried out the assessments and paid due regard, whether it be the Fairer Scotland duty or the public sector equality duty. But the more that you can raise awareness and understanding across your workforce, the better it is. And I'm in place for 1 more year. The Scottish Government asked to extend the post, or offered to extend the post for a year. So I'm going to be around to provide that support as well. So, for training, awareness raising, keep trying to provide as many resources as we can as possible to help this, help you. And the Improvement Service website and our YouTube channel have a variety of different presentations, including ones about all the links to legislation, about impact assessment. We've run some webinars in the past as well. There's a lot of resources there to enable you to carry out that training and awareness raising, or point people to go and do their own learning, or you can maybe build it into some e-learning platforms and you can take little snippets from them as well. There's also, it's useful to have things like toolkits, so things like integrated impact assessment toolkits that people use, or just, a standard Fairer Scotland duty assessment, just to use across your organisation. I know that lots of places are quite keen to have some form of online integrated impact assessment. Some of the councils have them in place. Aberdeenshire, East Ayrshire, North Ayrshire definitely have them. That can maybe help you take somebody through the process. Maybe you could use Microsoft Forms, SharePoint, different things if you've got some capacity in terms of IT. To enable you to just, help people go through the process, whether, they can maybe do some screening and see what kind of impact assessments they need to carry out, and make sure you embed the Fairer Scotland duty into that. I mentioned ensuring that you've got an understanding of the lived experience of people living in socio-economic disadvantage. So things like good community engagement, involvement and capacity building are really, really important. A lot of people who are living in socio-economic disadvantage are less likely to engage because they're just trying to get through the day and live their lives, and they're probably running flat out just to keep going, and working multiple jobs potentially. They don't have time to come to events, but it's about going out and engaging with them, but also then providing some support so that they have the capacity to do that, whether it be providing childcare, or just working with people to sort of improve their confidence to engage, and making sure that we think about the different ways that they want to have their voices heard. But it's also important not to sort of say to people that you want to talk about poverty or disadvantage. As people are proud, they don't want to necessarily admit that they're living in poverty. So it's about how you take engagement to them in other circumstances that they might be engaging with your service potentially, or if you don't engage directly with your customers, working with other partners in your local area through, for example, community planning, partnerships, or sort of getting national reports as well, to use that as your evidence and understanding of the impact of your decisions on people living in socioeconomic disadvantage. And it's also important to have an understanding of local and national data. So, as well as the lived experience and the qualitative stuff, it's really important to look at the quantitative stuff as well and understand. And it's not necessarily that you must have perfect local data. I mean, sometimes you just need data that's good enough to have an understanding of what's happening on the ground and how you might impact on that. It can be difficult to just get caught up in that evidence gathering and understanding, and wanting precise data, but it's generally important just to sort of have an understanding locally what's going on. And if you need more, if there are gaps, then commission, by all means, other data, or speak to partners to find out if they hold that. Certainly within our child poverty work, there's a lot of focus on making sure that we have the right data so you can target the right families. So colleagues and councils will have information that they could potentially share. And there's also sort of DWP and NOMIS information that can help you with local information too. Normally here I kind of stop and think about the impact, the links to other bits of legislation, but I thought I'll not go into detail, and I do have a separate presentation on that should anyone want it, linking the European Convention on Human Rights with the Human Rights Act for the UK, and then the Scotland Act, and then the various pieces of legislation that drive improvement in tackling inequality of outcomes. So things like the Education Act, and Children the Children and Young People Act, and things like that. So if anybody wants that, let me know. But there's definitely connectivity across a lot of pieces of legislation that are in place. So the Fairer Scotland duty didn't drop into a vacuum. There was a lot of work going on already. So it's just worthwhile reflecting on that and recognising that there's lots of different bits of legislation that kind of are already being delivered that help to that seek to target inequality of outcome. But I thought it was worth pausing and thinking about some of the things that can cause or exacerbate socioeconomic disadvantage. So things like restriction of transport or really expensive transport can mean difficulties in accessing work and school and other services. So making sure that people have access to affordable, timely transport in their areas is really important in terms of reducing socioeconomic disadvantage and enabling access. Removal of things like care services, either childcare or elderly care, that can restrict the ability to access work for some people, predominantly women generally, as they take on the majority of the caring burden statistically. Or it can mean that people with restricted incomes have to buy care, so thereby reducing their opportunities as well because they can't afford everything. Charging for services, there was an example over the last couple of years of increasing charges for instrumental tuition in schools, which meant that poorer children were unable to access the service. So, it discriminates against them. It's not a statutory duty to provide instrumental tuition, but actually, in terms of how you're providing that, only, more affluent families could afford to pay for it. So it was something to think about in terms of, well, if you start charging for that service, then there's a whole bunch of people who won't be able to access it. And, a lot of schools have put in mitigation in place to enable kids from families with lower incomes to still be able to access the service. One that you wouldn't necessarily think about straight away might be the introduction of low emission zones. But these will mean that you can, if I'm right, if you have a car of a certain age, you won't be able to go into the zones. And that could disproportionately disadvantage those who can't afford new cars. So we would need to make sure that access to the zones is fair for all. So there might be a need to subsidise some public transport for some people with low incomes. Might need to ensure that there's transport to access jobs at awkward times, for example, night shifts or back shifts. So making sure that that kind of approach takes into consideration access for everyone, particularly in the city centre where people might be working. Reductions in staffing levels via budget cuts. It's important to think about what kind of posts are most affected. Is it low paid posts held by local people? Are you exacerbating local poverty by cutting those services? You might have to pick up the costs of that unemployment through your service, and it might end up costing you more in the long run. So it's worthwhile thinking, and also have a negative impact on people's lives. And then also thinking about planning decisions on things like new build housing. Is there access? Is there transport? Sometimes the sort of new housing gets built, and if it's affordable housing, it needs to make sure that you've got those links to transport and schools and health centres and shops and so on. So just sort of an idea of kind of some of the things you might want to consider. And just quickly, you'd asked to sort of look at things like cumulative impact. So this is what results from incremental changes caused by other past, present, or reasonably foreseeable actions and decisions. So this can, if you have a look at the sort of cumulative impact that you're having over time, it can help you identify the impact of those multiple decisions coming together and changes to policies and functions, which can create an impact greater than or different to that each individual decision. So, for example, if you were increasing a range of different costs, it could ultimately add up and be quite a lot for someone on a low income, and they could no longer access all the services that they wish to. Some of you might be familiar with the cost of the school day work, which is an example of identifying the cumulative impact of all the different small costs for involvement in events and trips, as well as costs for uniforms, gym kit, outdoor clothes, and so on. So, there's a lot of work being done around that to see, how they all contribute to inequality or of access to certain things, but also then a huge chunk out of someone's weekly budget to be able to pay for all these different things. So sometimes children weren't getting the same access as their more affluent peers. So it might be useful to do an annual review of all your impact assessment reports, which is quite challenging. But if you did have something like an online impact assessment toolkit, that would make that easier. But it's worthwhile maybe now and again stopping and looking across all the impacts that have been identified. And particularly around socioeconomic disadvantage, to make sure that you're not sort of creating the snowball effect of lots of different things, creating greater and greater disadvantage. So it's important to understand that totality of your decision-making impacts. And then just a quick review of the implementation so far across Scotland. There's a wide range of strategic decisions that have been considered over the last 3 years. Most organisations seem to be using integrated impact assessment, incorporating the Fairer Scotland Duty assessment. But some of the challenges have included, as I mentioned before, there's lots and lots of different duties, and that's why people have got integrated impact assessment in place. But that can tend to lead to a kind of tick box approach to assessment, just because there's so much to consider. One of the challenges as well, as I've mentioned, is about agreeing what is a strategic decision, for your organisation. So there's no one size fits all. That's what's been difficult about the guidance. We can't, list absolutely everything that's a strategic decision for absolutely every organisation, because you're all so different and complex. There's issues with the quality of assessments. In the Mentee, someone was saying they weren't quite sure if the quality impact assessment or integrated impact assessment was getting carried out consistently across the organisation, so you can get different levels of quality of the assessments that are happening. And also, it's quite challenging to get the resources to carry out assessments, having enough people to sit down and take the time out. And I recognise that, having worked in councils myself, that, particularly for local authorities, it can be really challenging to get enough people and the time out to sit. And I imagine the same is for all the other organisations subject to the duty. That can be quite challenging, but it's worthwhile sort of building that into any process of any sort of major strategy or that kind of corporate strategic level that you're undertaking. So now we'll move on to some examples of practice. Just before Claire comes in, just sort of share some of these other examples. So the Scottish Ambulance Service had been delivering CPR training across Scotland, and they realised that actually areas of deprivation, there's a very low uptake of CPR training, and therefore they were able to, through their partner, target some of the training that they were going to carry out to particular areas and to try and get more population involved, because in terms of health inequalities, if you live in a more deprived area or on socio-economic disadvantage, more likely to have a heart attack or have some form of heart disease, where you might need CPR or in terms of other chronic conditions. So it was really important to make sure that some of the CPR training was boosted in some of those areas that there was low uptake, and a kind of Fairer Scotland Duty assessment process kind of brought that to light in terms of thinking about deprivation. Mid Lothian Council, actually quite a long time ago, I think not long after the Equality Act came in 2010, adopted socio-economic disadvantage as their 10th protected characteristic. So they've been thinking for a long time about the impact of large-scale new build housing on access to GP services, for example. So, where, maybe poorer communities were struggling to get appointments, and then suddenly all this new build housing's built, right beside them. So then those services are getting, pressurised, the same with the schools and early years provision. So that, it was potentially marginalising people in disadvantaged areas, and also some social disruption of the community. So, those are the kind of things that got flagged considering socioeconomic disadvantage. And then Aberdeenshire Council had mentioned about doing online integrated impact assessment. So they've developed a tool that we're all looking at just now, that brings together a few different types of assessment. And I know that other organisations have them as well, but there's a good example of how they've sort of built in Fairer Scotland Duty into that process and supporting employees to be able to do it. So I'm going to share these last two slides very quickly, just some of the support that's available. So there's a Fairer Scotland Duty Leads network. It meets every 8 weeks just now. If you would like to come along to that, then let me know. My contact details at the end of this, and you'll have got my email address from the Teams invite. So we try and come together, share our problems, share issues, try and find solutions, share experience. That's how we found out from Davy and Claire, the kind of things that they were doing, and harangued them to come along and do some presentations for us, which has been fantastic. So if you'd like to join that, do let me know. We've had some speakers in to cover things like, the sort of cross-cutting things about poverty and gender, poverty and ethnicity. We're doing a joint webinar now with the child poverty coordinators as well about poverty and disability. As I mentioned, I'm the coordinator. I'm in post till September, or till the end of August next year, really. And we've got the Knowledge Hub, and I'll send a link around for that, and the link's also embedded in these slides. And there's the refreshed guidance that's going to be out, and I should have updated that now that the Scottish Government have told me it will be out during Challenge Poverty Week. So within that, there's this, it sort of runs through all the different definitions and the different expectations of you, but we've tried to make it a bit more practical and got additional examples of the components of socioeconomic disadvantage and inequality of opportunity, and a few questions there to help you when you're considering due regard. So, sort of the things to help you lead through that discussion with others, perhaps. We've kind of built in some of the reference to other work that's been ongoing around things like the Human Rights Framework for Scotland, and the incorporation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, a section on organisational readiness to make sure that you are ready and able to implement the duty, a wee bit of expansion on how to meet it, some new case studies, some updated data sources, and there's an evaluation tool which, if you want to assess yourself, having maybe carried out a few failure Scotland duty assessments, you can have a look back and use the evaluation tool to sort of check, did you go through the steps to make sure that you're sort of getting it in place in the right way. It's not mandatory, it's just there as a tool because we were asked to provide something like that that can help you with your assessment yourself. So we're kind of got 2 minutes left. So here are my details, but if anybody's got any other questions, then please shout out now. I'll leave those details up for a wee minute and then but again, I'll send the slides round to you all and you'll have them all.